reading The Black Pope, A History of the Jesuits by M.F. Cusack. We are in chapter 11. This is a long chapter again, but we are almost completed with this book. I think we've only got like 2 more chapters after this. Oh, no, 3. And then after that is the appendix. So, very good. Chapter 11, the heading, The Gunpowder Plot and the Massacre of St. Bartholomew. The Jesuits, the sole originator of the Gunpowder Plot. Futile efforts to deny this. How Rome teaches history. Pope Paul IV tries to bribe Queen Elizabeth. Offers to condone her supposed illegitimacy. Excommunicates her when she refuses submission. The secular clergy praise Elizabeth for her clemency and bitterly accuse the Jesuits of making disturbances. Letter of the Pope complaining of the immorality of his own priest. The Pope obliges English Romanists to commit treason. The present Pope canonizes them for it. James I succeeds Elizabeth, banishes the Jesuits. They then declare him illegitimate. They approve and help the Gunpowder Plot, a plot lately revealed of a similar character to be carried out at the present day. Assassination approved in the confessional. Contrast between the fair and open trial given to the Jesuit Garnet and the secret practices of the Inquisition. Falsehoods written by a dying man to shield Garnet. The massacre of St. Bartholomew, how planned and how executed. I'm having a problem here with my computer. Okay. There is no event in English history which should be more carefully remembered than this of the Gunpowder Plot. Yet it has become the fashion to ignore it or speak of it as if it had been an event of long past ages. Romanists, who now so long ago were thoroughly ashamed of it, speak of it now in an airy fashion, as something with which they really had no concern. Even the Jesuit fathers, whose society was the sole origin of this, and so many other plots to deprive Englishmen of their religious and political liberty, give lectures on the subject and declare that it is all a mistake to credit them with the plot. It was a put-up job to throw them into discredit. Fools may believe them, but the historical evidence against them is far too strong to allow of honest denial. Facts are stubborn things, and the facts and the history are all against the Jesuits. However, it may be said, because it can be proved, that neither history nor scripture are of much account with these men, and either can be remodeled to suit their particular views. We have already given evidence of this. Besides, when the Church of Rome has power, she will at once destroy all historical evidence which tells against her. It is useless to say that she will not do this, for she has already announced her intention to do it to a generation which will not listen to a voice of warning. And the Jesuit scheme for the Reformation of England, republished by the Jesuits in 1889 with the highest commendation, this one particular point is insisted on. Public and private libraries are to be searched and examined for books, also all bookbinders and stationers. And all books which the Church pronounces heretical are to be at once destroyed. What havoc will be made one day of the British Museum when it becomes the Pope's library. What has been done in England may be done again. In the reign of that queen who has been justly called Bloody Mary, a law was passed that anyone who had a heretical book, if they did not burn them at once without showing them to anyone, would be hung. How terribly afraid Rome is of knowledge. Romanists naturally make light of the persecutions of Mary. But when did Elizabeth ever issue such a tyrannical enactment? But for Romanists, history must be believed and written according to Rome. We have already shown how this is done in colleges under Jesuit control, It is remarkable that Romanists are now declaring openly that they require not only that they shall have schools where they may teach their own religion, but that they may also have schools where they may teach their own history. A speech was made in the Roman Catholic Bishop of Newport at Cardiff, in which it is plainly stated that Romanists will insist on teaching their own history and even their own geography, as well as their own religion. He said sometimes non Catholics would ask with amazement what objection Catholics could have to a board school where no religion was forced on them. In board schools, history and geography were taught by teachers trained in Protestant views, and general information was imparted by men and women who were saturated with anti Catholic prejudice. Catholicism touched history and general knowledge at 1,000 points. From the tablet, January 18th, page 189. As a specimen of how history is expurgated for the use of Romanists, we may say here that in the Clifton Tracts, a Roman Catholic publication, it is stated that the persecutions under Mary and the cruelties practiced by the Inquisition are all nursery fables. The gunpowder plot was simply a last despairing effort of the Jesuits to secure a Roman Catholic succession for England and to place her under the heel of Rome. Plot after plot had been discovered and frustrated ere this fiendish scheme was planned. And here it should be noted that Romanists are constantly bringing forward those who suffered in the reign of Queen Elizabeth as martyrs for their faith, and thereby securing the sympathy of a certain class of Englishmen. But the facts are very different. In the reign of Mary, men, women, and even those who might also be called children were burned alive and tortured simply because they would not submit to the Roman Catholic Church. In the reign of Elizabeth, those who were executed had an open, public, and fair trial, and they were executed simply and solely for treason. But here, again, the duplicity of Rome comes in a falsified history. These men knew well that they were simply hung for plotting and doing their evil best against the Queen and throne of England. But they did not call this treason, for they openly avowed and openly taught that they owed no allegiance to Elizabeth, but their sole allegiance was to the Pope, and that as he had excommunicated Elizabeth, it was their duty to assassinate her as an act of loyalty to the Pope. A consideration of the subject from this point of view is important because there is so much historical misrepresentation at the present day. For all the facts here stated, there is ample historical proof. How sad it will be if English children are not allowed to read for themselves the true history of their native land. Now, the facts of the case are very simple, and there is abundant, indisputable evidence to prove them. When Sir Edward Carne, the English ambassador at Rome, notified Paul IV of the succession of Elizabeth to the throne, he told Carne that England was a fief of the Holy See and that it was great temerity in Elizabeth to have assumed, without his participation, the title of queen. Pope Paul IV, finding that Elizabeth was firm and determined to hold her own, offered to let things remain as they were, provided she would acknowledge his primacy and reformation from him. Pius IV, his successor, proffered the same conditions to the Queen by letter, written May 5th, 1560, wherein he offered to comply with all her requests to the utmost of his power, provided she will allow of his primacy. Pius V, the same pope who afterwards issued the bull of excommunication against Elizabeth. 33 years after Elizabeth's birth, and in the seventh year of her reign, offered to reverse the papal sentence which declared her illegitimate, if she would submit to his rule. The Spanish ambassador in England, de Silva, assured Queen Elizabeth that she had only to express a desire to that effect, and the Pope would immediately remove the difficulty. Camden, in his Annals of Elizabeth, gives the text of a letter addressed by Pope Pius IV to Elizabeth under date May 15th, 1560, wherein he addressed her as our most dear daughter in Christ, Elizabeth, Queen of England, expressing his great desire to take care of her salvation and to provide as well for her honor as the establishment of her kingdom. It is one of the special prerogatives of a pope to be able to make or unmake sin at his pleasure. The Roman Catholic Church teaches that it is a sin of incest for a nephew and a niece to marry, but the Pope can unmake the sin and allow it to be committed, provided a sufficiently large sum of money is paid into the papal treasury. So, in the case of Queen Elizabeth, if she had submitted herself and her kingdom to the Pope and allowed his Italian cardinal to rule her country, we should have heard nothing of her illegitimacy. One scarcely knows which to admire most, the courage of Queen Elizabeth on her moderation under circumstances which were of the most exasperating character, especially to a woman of her temperament. And these noble traits are fully admitted by so many Roman Catholic priests that we can only make a selection from their writings on this subject. Bitterly indeed, the secular priests complain, and not without ample cause, of the ruin brought not only on England, but on the Church of Rome itself by the plots and intrigues of the Jesuits. In the year 1601, sundry secular priests published during the reign of Elizabeth a statement of their case with an epistolary introduction written by priest Watson. It is entitled Important Considerations which ought to move all true and sound Catholics who are not wholly Jesuitized to acknowledge without all evocations, ambiguities, or shiftings that the proceedings of Her Majesty Elizabeth and of the state with them since the beginning of Her Highness' reign have both been mild and merciful. It cannot be denied, say the secular priests, the writers of this document, but that for the first 10 years of Her Majesty's reign, the state of England was tolerable, and after a sort in some good quietness. These secular priests tried even to induce the Jesuits to cease from their disloyal and felonious attempts to murder Elizabeth and overthrow her government. They said, in the beginning of her kingdom, she did deal somewhat more gently with Catholics. None were then urged by her or pressed either to her sect or to the denial of their faith. All things, indeed, did seem to proceed in a far milder course. No great complaints were heard of. And these secular priests for themselves state, for while as Her Majesty and the state dealt with the Catholics, so you have heard, which was full 11 years, no one Catholic being called in question of his life for his conscience at all time. Consider with us how some of our profession proceeded with them. And they then describe the plottings of the Jesuits in this country, which brought upon them the retribution they richly deserved. They conclude by admitting that these foreign Jesuital practices had been the cause of all their troubles, and that they might have continued in peace, and none making them afraid, were it not for the treasons and rebellions stirred up by the Jesuits and their party against the Queen and lawful government of the country. It should be observed here, however, that these priests make no objection to the teaching of the Jesuits. They themselves would teach the same moral code. They do not object to the Jesuits because their teaching is unscriptural, but because they are busybodies, plotters, and insistent disturbers of the public peace, and because they wanted to control everyone. Before it is said or believed that Rome was changed, it would be well to know that Rome is doing what Rome is doing today. At the urgent solicitation of the late Cardinal Manning and of the Jesuit and Orator fathers, and of his own infallible will, the present Pope has canonized the men who defied the authority of their queen, and one of whom, John Felton, posted a copy of the bull of Pius V, excommunicating Queen Elizabeth, his lawful sovereign, on the doors of the Bishop of London's palace. Elizabeth was no longer the Pope's most dear daughter in Christ. The bull of damnation and excommunication of Elizabeth, Queen of England, and her adherents bore date 5th of the Calends of March, 1570. The bull anathematized and excommunicated Elizabeth as a slave of impiety, a heretic, and a favorer of heretics. The Pope disposed her and deprived her of her alleged pretended right to the crown of England as illegitimate. He absolved all her subjects from their allegiance and all other from their oaths, and that forever. He positively enjoined disobedience under penalty of the same anathema and excommunications as were denounced against the queen, and placed the whole land under his curse and interdict. This was an open declaration of war against England, and the Pope was the aggressor. John Felton, who published the bull, as stated above, was canonized recently for the act. And it is worthy of note that when Pius V, who issued this bull, was canonized, one of the great deeds for which he was given this honor was the issue of this bull disposing the lawful Queen of England and of urging her secret assassination. Romanists declare that these men whom they have so recently canonized were martyrs for their religion, thereby making it the duty of a good Catholic to murder and rebel against their rulers, since the doing of it procures for the doers the highest honors which their church can pay them. So many are the inconsistencies of Rome that one is not surprised to find the same canonized pope at one moment denouncing Queen Elizabeth for allowing married priests, and in the next declaring in no measured language that his church was reeking with the impurities of his unmarried priests. In an apostolic letter addressed to the Archbishop of Salzburg, Pius wrote that he had been informed by the best authority on the spot that the greater part of the beneficed and dignified clergy in Germany, who ought to set the best example without fear of God or man, kept concubines openly and introduced them into churches and public places like lawful wives, giving them titles of their own dignities and offices, that from the contempt thus brought upon the clergy by themselves, they had lost all authority, and hence the increase of heresy, which can never be repressed till the abominable vice of concubinage is extirpated. It would be impossible to relate here the many plots which the popes and the Jesuits made to assassinate Elizabeth and to ruin England. That the same treason would be practiced today were it at all possible, and that it may be made possible, practiced ere long, there can be no matter of doubt, since today the men who perpetuated these crimes have received the highest honors which the church can pay them. Before the Church of Rome canonizes anyone, she makes the most exact and rigorous inquiries as to their life, and the books, if any, which they have written, are all most fully approved down to the most minute particular. In the case of those who shed their blood for the faith, no such minute inquiry is considered necessary. But it is clear that when the Roman Catholic Church canonizes men solely because they were hung for treason, she thereby sets the seal of her highest approval on treason. Indeed, she could scarcely do otherwise, since Rome claims universal and temporal sovereignty. It should also be said that treason and assassination were especially taught as a religious duty. Hold on 1 minute. I don't want to. Okay. I just want to make sure I didn't change. Okay. Forget it. It should also be said that treason and assassination were especially taught as a religious duty in Roman Catholic colleges, as indeed they are at the present day. Camden informs us that out of these seminaries, the Jesuit colleges in France and Rome, first a few young men, and then more as they grew up, entering over hastily into holy orders, and being instructed in such principles of doctrine as these, were sent forth into the divers parts of England and Ireland to administer, as they pretend, the sacraments of the Romish religion and to preach. But the queen and her council found that they were sent underhand to withdraw the subjects from their allegiance and obedience due to their prince, to bind them by reconciliation, to perform the Pope's commandments, to raise intestine rebellions under the seal of confession, and flatly to execute the sentence of Pius Quintus against the queen. Evidence of the seditious instruction given to the missioners sent forth from these colleges is furnished by the letter of Cardinal d'Ossat to Henry IV of France, November 26th, 1601, in which the cardinal writes that, quote, the chief thing attended in these colleges is to instill into the youths the belief that the King of Spain is the rightful heir to the crown of England, unquote. The gunpowder plot, the reign of James the First, or one. But as all the attempts made during the reign of Elizabeth proved abortive, and as the Jesuits were enraged to madness by the failure of their plots, they say now that assassination of kings and princes was not so easily accomplished. So they devised a new and horrible scheme for the attainment of their ends. As usual, their plans were laid with consummate cunning. The provincial of their order, Henry Garnet, came to England attended by Jesuits chosen with the greatest care for the work. These men disguised themselves in every way possible so as to escape notice and to reach and converse with Roman Catholics without detection. Again, they used the confessional for their fell purpose. Though Catholics had then perfect liberty for the exercise of their religion, it was often a matter of some difficulty for them to get confession, as priests were comparatively scarce and locomotion was then very slow and difficult. Besides, the prestige of the Jesuits made them especially acceptable as confessors. They did not fail to uphold their own cause or to extol the special privileges which they had forced or cajoled from the Holy See from time to time. This then was their opportunity, and they knew how to use it. Words said in the confessional are viewed by Romanists as veritably and actually said by God Himself. How easy then was it to arouse the feelings and inspire the hopes, no, let's see, in the hopes of the kneeling penitent. The one word was claim England for Rome. No sin could be committed which would not be pardoned if the penitent placed himself and above all his fortune in the hands of his Jesuit confessor for this purpose. It needs to know something personally of the tremendous power of the Church of Rome to realize the way in which it controls and possesses the bodies and souls of men. No doubt many of these men were very willing to embroil their country again in a religious war, above all when there was no question of being deprived of the free exercise of their religion. But what matter? The word of the priest, above all the word of the Jesuit, must prevail, and the consent was given to any measure that might be purposed. Garnet was attended by other Jesuits, all disguised and all bent on the same fell design. But there was need for great diplomacy. It was necessary to throw odium on King James, and it is so easy for infallible popes to make and unmake legitimacy or to make and unmake sin that it needed only a whisper from the confessor that after all James had no right to the throne, for he was probably illegitimate. Not a word, be sure, would have been said on this subject if James had played into the hands of the Jesuits. A candidate was also provided. The Jesuits do not do their work by halves. The king once got rid of, no matter how, it was absolutely necessary to have a substitute ready on the spot, and the substitute was found. The Jesuits, who could make and unmake kings and nobles at their own sweet will, discovered that after all, the rightful heir to the throne of England was not James I, but a lady, Arabella Stuart, the daughter of Earl of Lennox. She was prepared to accept the crown from the Jesuits, and it only needed to assure the Romanists who wavered that it really was their duty to see that the right heir had her own. And then there was the name of Stuart to conjure with. Fatal as it has been, so has been its possessors. Stuart. That was Mary Stuart, if I'm not mistaken. It was one that was in partaker of. Abraham Lincoln's death, too. That's something to think about. Okay. It is amazing, and if the subject were not so serious, it would be amusing to see with what consummate skill the Jesuits have hoodwinked the public, how they must rejoice at their success, and what a fund of amusement their dupes must afford them. They ask the deepest sympathy and too often get it for men who were hung for treason, who would have been hung or shot for the same crime in any country, but whom they represent as having been martyrs to their religion, because that tells so well and so effectively with the English public. In modern times, the position of our by no means remote ancestors is scarcely understood, subject as they were to continual plots against their liberties and treasons against their government and queen. After a time, the Manchester martyrs will be proposed for canonization, and they will be quite as worthy of it. The spies whom the Jesuits sent all through the length and breadth of England are also represented as suffering for their faith when they were discovered and justly punished. These men would simply have been shot on sight if they had attempted such exploits elsewhere. They came to spy out the land for a foreign prince and to excite by every means in their power those who were most inflammable against their lawful rulers. Short work should be made of all this nonsense, and the common sense of the people of this country should be aroused to see its true character. If any English king or queen had acted in a similar manner in regard to the popes who made war on them, how very differently the matter would be represented by Romanists. And in the meantime, while all these beguilements are being used to blind honest people, Rome is teaching openly the doctrine of rebellion against lawful kings and the duty of freeing subjects from their allegiance whenever she pleases to dispose a sovereignty. In his essays on religion, Cardinal Manning says, quote, if, therefore, a heretical prince is elected or succeeds to the throne, the Church of Rome has a right to say, I annul the election or I forbid the succession, unquote. And again, that, quote, the Pope can inflict temporal punishments on sovereigns for heresy and deprive them of their kingdoms and free their subjects from obedience, unquote. This is ample historical evidence that Romanists had almost absolute liberty for the exercise of their religion during the first 12 years of the reign of Queen Elizabeth. Nor were they ungrateful, as they frequently declared. It was not until the restless and evil spirit which possessed the Jesuits had its sway that a renewal of severities was commenced. During the closing years of the life of Elizabeth, severe laws were enacted and enforced against the Catholics. But this was an absolute necessity. If the kingdom was to be preserved from a deluge of blood, if Englishmen were to rule their own country and possess their liberties, something needed to be done for their protection from a foreign foe. There is one remarkable difference between the manner in which Protestant and Christian England acted when obliged to prosecute her enemies and the enemies of God, and the way in which papal and half pagan Rome acted when she desired to possess herself of these fair realms. We do not find that Englishmen made plots for assassination of the Pope or carried on secret war in his country as he did in England. And such has ever been the marked difference between the action of the children of light and the children of darkness. Unhappy Ireland, taught and practically governed by Papal Rome, has her secret crimes and midnight assassinations, her cruel outrages on dumb animals, her thefts of property. England, too, alas, has her crimes, but they are the crimes of fallen humanity and not the crimes of demons. The death of the brave Elizabeth gave new hope to the plotters of treason. James I was believed to be a Catholic at heart. The Jesuits at least hoped that he would repay them for all they had done or tried to do for his hapless Mary, Queen of Scots. But they soon found their mistake. Probably he had seen quite enough of the restless plotting. Hold on. Hold on. Let me reread that, okay? Let me reread that. The death of the brave Elizabeth gave new hopes to the plotters of treason. James I was to believe to be a Catholic at heart. The Jesuits, at least, hoped that he would repay them for all they had done, or tried to do, for his hapless mother. Mary Queen of Scots, but they soon found their mistake. Probably he had been quite enough of their restless plotting to have learned a lesson which stood him in good stead. He at once issued a decree by which the Jesuits must still remain abroad. In fact, he placed them in the same position as that in which they had found themselves during the latter part of the reign of Elizabeth. Probably his indolent and easygoing nature made him averse to political broils or secret plottings, and so he took prompt precautions to free himself and his kingdom from those who were sure to embroil it. But he gave a large measure of toleration to English Romanists who, if they pleased, could have lived as peaceful Englishmen in amity with their fellow countrymen. Now, over here, there is a letter, and it says, whoops, I dropped something. I don't know if I can read it, but I can certainly try. The mysterious letter. And it says, My Lord, one of the love I believe to. I don't think I could read this. Guys, I would really like to read it to you, but I can't read this person's handwriting. So we're just not going to read that. I can't read their handwriting. I'm certainly cannot. Forgive me. There is ample evidence that English Catholics would have been contented and peaceful subjects if they had been left in peace by the ever restless and ever plotting Jesuit. But this was not to be. The Jesuits determined on a wholesale massacre of heretics, and acting on the principles so lately and so highly approved by their fathers, they determined to secure a Roman Catholic succession by murdering all the Protestant royal family at one fell blow. The history of the gunpowder plot is so well known that it needs only to be related here in outline. Garnet had made the acquaintance on the continent of Robert Catesby, an English Catholic of good family. Catesby was ambitious and ready for revolt. Garnet applied to him on his arrival in England and induced him to join in the plot. It was necessary to be most circumspect in the selection of his fellow conspirators, so that the number was not complete till the close of the year 1604. Their names were Thomas Percy, a young profligate and spendthrift, but bold even to rashness, from the celebrated family of the Earls of Northumberland. Thomas and Robert Winter, two brothers who had suffered under the government of Elizabeth. Guido Hawkes, a soldier and formerly an officer in the Spanish service. Francis Tresham and Ambrose Rookwood, both of noble blood and intimate friends of Catesby. Everard Digby, a man of considerable means and great talents. Robert Keyes, Christopher Wright, John Grant, and lastly, Tom Bates, a servant of Catesby. Just the man for such a purpose, as he had been initiated into his master's secret from the beginning. Still, Catesby considered it well, before the formal commencement of the conspiracy, that this latter, on account of his facilitating scruples of conscience, should be especially schooled by Father Oswald Tesman. But the Jesuit leader of the conspiracy found an unexpected difficulty among his followers. More humane and more just than he was, when they had realized the enormity of the plan and the fearful loss of life which it must cause, they asked what was to become of so many of their own faith who most certainly would be present at the opening of Parliament, and who must also perish. But the Jesuit would have his end, even if it needed to wade in the blood of his own people to attain it. He assured the unhappy men who hung on his word as on the word of God, that this would be merely the usual fate of battle, that they might be obliged to attack a walled-in city, and that many Catholics might suffer as well as the heretics whom they must destroy, and they were satisfied. The word of the priest was all that was needed to make crime a virtue. But after all, these men were human. They had, some of them at least, the best instincts of humanity, and these instincts triumphed over their false religion. We shall show later that Garnet was fully cognizant of the plot, and that the only scruples which these unhappy men had were removed by him. They asked if it was right to kill so many of their own faith who would evidently suffer in the general massacre. But Garnet promptly silenced all their difficulties. Let us give a meed of pity to these victims of a cruel and Christless religion. The conspirators should indeed be condemned, and condemned justly for their crime. But our just and most earnest reprobation should be reserved for the church which urged them to commit it, and which has not only never repented of her evil deed, but rather has at the present day placed the seal of her highest approval on her dupes by canonizing them. The people of England are indebted to the humanity of one of the conspirators for deliverance from one of the most horrible plots and outrages that ever that has ever been attempted in the world's history. And yet there are those at the present day who listened with attention to Jesuit fathers who declared that this plot was none of their doing, and then laugh at the folly of the dupes who believed them. The conspirator, Thresham, was the revealer of the plot. His sister was married to Lord Monteagle, and Lord Monteagle would certainly be present at the opening of Parliament. Perhaps also Lady Monteagle might be there. There is ample corroborative evidence to show that the mysterious letter addressed to this nobleman was written by his brother in law. This and this alone saved England. God alone knows what misery, what bloodshed, what fiendish atrocities would have resulted if the gunpowder plot had succeeded. Everything had been planned to follow up the blow. For the moment, Protestant courage might have been crushed when the mangled corpses of the king and the princes and hundreds of the leading men of the country had been seen lying in their gore in Westminster precincts. But it is quite certain that the shock would have been only temporary and the reprisals would have been terrible and sure. Who could have blamed the Protestants if, after such a destruction, they had risen up in their strength and enacted a massacre which had included every Catholic in the land? Yet, such a massacre would have been justified if any enemy had adopted such tactics in ordinary warfare. England was saved, but how near England was to this most awful peril at the hands of Rome should never be forgotten. The Acuum, or the fears of the king, saved England. The Stuarts were generally fools when their own interests were in question, but they were not without wit in other matters. The result is well known. It is a matter of history. It is a history which well known, but which should never be forgotten, though Rome makes useless efforts to conceal her share in this and kindred subjects. On the night of the 4th of November, the vaults were searched, the conspiracy was discovered, and England was saved from the most diabolical plot which the mind of man has ever conceived. But we shall be told by confiding Protestants and even by worldly minded Christians that such terrors are impossible at the present day. Can we be sure of this? Has Rome changed? She declares herself solemnly that she cannot change. I admit, however, that one proved fact is worth 1,000 assertions. In a serial now publishing, which I do not wish to advertise by giving the name, a plot to murder every Protestant, i.e., every member of Parliament who is not avowedly Roman Catholic, a plot quite as clever and, if possible, more diabolical than the gunpowder plot, is openly revealed. The plotters are named because they have died recently, but they were Irish Roman Catholics. Irish Roman Catholics do not commit deadly crime without the knowledge and full approbation of their spiritual guides. God help them, and may God forgive the Christian people who support and encourage this cruel religion. The Jesuit conspirators did not all escape. The principal men engaged in the plot were taken alive, but Catesby and several others were killed by the soldiers who were sent to effect their capture. but not until they had suffered themselves from an explosion of gunpowder, which took place by accident when they were drying powder. Even these hardened men, when the suffering came to themselves, realized in some slight degree the crime which they had committed, but it was too late to repent, even if they had any desire to do so. The details of the various trials of the conspirators are simply a sickening history of evocation and subterfuge. Each was anxious to know what had been revealed by the other, and each made admissions, however trifling, which, when compared, helped to the utter condemnation of all. But here we must observe the wide difference between these trials and the practices of the Inquisition. The prisoners were all allowed to speak to their own defense, in their own defense. The Jesuit Garnet especially took considerable advantage of this permission. It is true that torture was used in some cases in the tower, but this was the evil custom of the age, which had been introduced by the Roman Catholic Church and persistently practiced by the Inquisition. It is remarkable how easily Protestants are led astray on this subject. Rome demands the utmost sympathy from them for those who were tortured in this and other cases, but Rome smiles grimly when she does so, knowing that she first introduced these cruelties and that she practiced them as no other church ever did. Where or when has she ever expressed her sympathies with her victims? A word must be said about Tresham, the betrayer of the plot. In order, if possible, to save himself, he blamed and accused the conspirators one after another, especially included the Jesuit Garnet. But as he lay dying, such is the power of Rome and the terrible fear which it impresses on its followers, he dictated a letter which gave to his wife to deliver to the Earl of Salisbury after his death, in which he retracted what he had said of Garnet and swore on his salvation that Garnet knew nothing of the plot, and moreover, that he had not seen him before 16 years before. He swore too much, for there was already undeniable proof that he had frequent intercourse with Garnet, and that he had stayed at Tresham's house in Northamptonshire a few days before the discovery of the plot. This is the fruit of evocation, writes Sir Edward Coke to Lord Salisbury, to affirm manifold falsehoods upon his salvation when he was in articulo mortis. When Tresham was apprehended, a book which he had apparently well studied was found in his desk, entitled A Treatise of Equivocation. An alteration on the title page in Garnet's handwriting was found, which ran thus: A Treatise Against Lying and Fraudulent Dissimulation. This book was published at the close of the reign of Queen Elizabeth. No doubt, Garnet's equivocal title was well adapted to induce honest people to read this dishonest book, and perhaps to lead them to appreciate practically the advice which it gave. Even from a worldly point of view, honesty is the best policy, for the Jesuits have failed again and again in their most important undertakings, and have not even gained the ends which they sought in such an evil fashion. Digby, Winter, Grant, and Bates were executed at the same time and place. Digby said he had committed no offense against his religion, which was true. But what a religion it is which justifies and indeed requires such crimes. Winter never asked mercy of God or king. According to his religion, he had committed no offense against God and none against the king. Grant excused himself also on the ground of conscience and religion. Bate asked forgiveness of God and the king, and said what was probably true, that he had been led into the plot from love to his master. The next day, Winter the younger, Rookwood, Keyes, and Guido Fawkes were executed, and no doubt all these men will be canonized later by the church, which they served so well. Winter expressed some regret for his crime, but declared his faith in the religion which had practically obliged him to commit it. Rookwood spoke in much the same manner. Keyes did not attempt any excuse, and was followed by Guido Fawkes, who seemed somewhat sorry for his crime, and so ended life in this world for the tools of the Jesuits. One and all were inspired by the same idea that they were meriting heaven by attempting the murder of a whole nation in their representatives. Their descendants have at least the consolation of knowing that the church, in whose interests they suffered so cruelly, what has shown, even at the present day, her high appreciation of their efforts by placing the seal of her highest approval on their conduct. Surely they have the best encouragement which their church can give for any attempt, however diabolical, which may be made at the present day to alter the succession to the throne of England. The one great object of these unhappy men seemed to have been to screen the men who taught them to murder from the consequences of their crime. But one and all admitted that both the Jesuit Garnet and the Jesuit Greenway knew all the plans of the conspirators under the seal of confession. Now, a great deal has been made of the sacredness of the seal of confession, and even Protestants have taken in by the idea that it is a question of honor. They say, naturally, as honorable Englishmen, these priests are to be respected because they will not betray such a sacred confidence. This is all very fair, they say. If we are to have confession, we must have secrecy. But there is another and a very grave side of this question, which is quite overlooked. One word of disapproval from the priest would at once put an end to such plots. Let us take an example. When Guido Fawkes or Digby or any of the conspirators went to confession to their Jesuit guides, one word of disapproval from the priest would have at once put an end to the whole matter. When any of the Irish invincibles went to confession, as all such men admit they have done before committing crimes, one word from the priest would prevent the murder. But the priest never says the word, and the priest gives absolution, and the men know that the work which they have taken in hand has the blessing and even the highest encouragement of the church, and hence they believe of God. Hence, the excuse of the priest that he cannot reveal plots which have been told to him in the secrecy of confession is a mere pretense. He knows them. He could prevent them with a word. He is therefore not only guilty in an ordinary sense, but he is guilty in the highest sense, for he places the seal of the divine approval, as far as it is in his power to do so, on the most deadly crime. We may blind a confiding public with the supposed high sense of honor, but he cannot deceive the Almighty. A man who will not prevent deadly crime when he could do so with a word is far more guilty than the hapless wretches who've committed it. Garnet was tried at Guildhall, London on March 28, 1606. Never had criminal a fairer trial. A special commission was appointed, amongst whom were the following noblemen and gentlemen: the Lord Mayor of London, the Earls of Nottingham, Suffolk, Worcester, Northampton, and Salisbury, the Lord Chief Justice of England, and several judges and aldermen. The king and many of the noblemen were present secretly. The charge was high treason. Garnet, having objected to one of the jurors, he was at once removed. How very differently would a Protestant have been treated in the Inquisition? How very differently would Garnet himself have been treated if he had offended his own society? In that case, there would have been no trial and no defense, for life and death then hung without trial or inquiry on the word of the general. Garnet's defense, if such I can be called, was one continued issue of equivocation and of excuses for equivocation. The matter was, after all, very simple, though he was obliged to cloud it with as much verbiage as possible to deceive the public. He had committed the crime of treason according to the law and justice, but as this crime was an act of the highest virtue according to the teaching then and now of the church to which he belonged, he considered himself justified not only in committing it, but also in denying it. The full details of his trial were published at the time. We had purported to have even large extracts from it, but space will not admit, and they would not be of interest to the general reader. Some valuable documents concerning it have disappeared from public offices, and the only wonder is that so many have remained. Garnet was executed on May 3rd, 1606, not for his religion, except in so far as in the exercise of it he committed treason and gave his sanction and encouragement to a vile and cruel crime. Sir Dudley Charlton said in a letter still preserved that he doubted not that Garnet would equivocate on the gallows, but that he would be hanged without equivocation. It should be noticed here that Garnet was accused of having had improper intercourse with a Mrs. Anne Fole, and they and that he denied this on the scaffold. But of what avail were his denials? Whether he was falsely accused or not, it is at least certain that she followed him everywhere, and that they had a very close correspondence and friendship. It was also remarked by those who were near him on the scaffold that he appeared very much frightened, and that his prayers were uttered with little apparent devotion and were chiefly addressed to the Virgin Mary. There was no earnest expression of hope in the love or mercy of God, nor of the love for Christ, or desire to go to him. By the king's command, he was left hanging from the gallows until he was dead, a merciful deed, considering how Garnet had prepared so cruel a death for his lawful sovereign. The usual story of miraculous events was got up after his death. A youth named Wilkinson declared that he visited the place of Garnet's execution for the purpose of finding a relic, and naturally did find one. This was a bit of straw on which the appearance of a man's face was rudely pictured, which was reputed to have been done miraculously. Probably this relic was neither more nor less genuine than the straws which was venerated in Belgium for some time, which the poor people were assured had been taken from the bed on which the Pope was obliged to be when put in prison by Victor Emmanuel, his cruel prosecutor. The Massacre of St. Bartholomew. The story of the Massacre of St. Bartholomew must briefly be told. In the whole history of Christendom, never was such an outrage perpetrated. It is idle to say that it had not the approval of the Pope. There is too much evidence to the contrary. The teaching of the Church of Rome is so plain and clear on the subject of equivocation that no Roman Catholic can be believed on his most solemn oath on any subject whatsoever, and denials are of little avail when facts are posed to them. No wonder that Rome has special men trained to write for the press of this country and to supply the leading magazines with essays and articles teaching insidiously her own views on all subjects, especially on history. No wonder that she depreciates the late professor of history in Oxford. Mr. Froude was far too honest and made too many revelations which disclosed facts that Rome would fain have hid to obtain even her toleration. Ere long, she will have the Protestant universities of England in the hands of her own professors, since the thin end of the wedge has been put in. And when those who have been accepted by Protestants as liberal Roman Catholics shall have served her term, she will replace them by others who will teach all she desires. The massacre of St. Bartholomew was carefully and deliberately planned. The object was simply the extermination of the Protestants of France who had fought for their country and loved it. The bloody plot was arranged by Catherine de' Medici and the Duke of Alva. These worthies met at Bayonne in the south of France in the year 1565. And while they amused the public with games, they spent their own time planning the murder of their defenseless subjects, whose only crime was that they loved God better than the Pope, and that they worshiped Christ and looked to him alone for salvation, instead of to the Church and the Virgin. The Pope wrote to Catherine, "It is only by the entire extermination of Protestants that the Roman Catholic religion can be restored completely." Henry of Berne, subsequently Henry IV, and then a little child, who it was supposed was too young to understand what was said, overheard and remembered a sentence in the conversation of the plotters. "The head of one salmon is worth that of 10,000 frogs." This he repeated to his governor, who at once suspected danger and warned the Protestant party without delay. The result being that the massacre had to be deferred, but it was only deferred. A wedding took place in the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris on the 18th of August, 1572. This was part of the plot. Protestants were invited, who came suspecting no evil, when Margaret of France and Henry of Berne were united in holy wedlock. Jean d'Albert, mother of the bridegroom, not Jean, Jean d'Albert, mother of the bridegroom, was a noted Protestant, but in a week's time she died with every appearance of having been poisoned. The massacre commenced at daybreak on Sunday, August 24th, 1572. The unfortunate king, Charles IX, hesitated long before he would consent to the crime, but his mother and the priest were too strong for him. Lest he might relent at the last moment and forbid the savage act, the queen mother had the signal given an hour earlier than the time which had been decided on. The brave and noble Admiral Coligny was the first victim. And when the fiendish butchers waded in the blood of the best, the noblest, the purest men and women of France, so well had the plot been arranged and so far in advance that even the Protestant troops had been removed from Paris on a spacious pretense. Nor was the massacre confined to Paris. The same bloody deed was enacted all over France, so it was estimated that 70,000 persons perished. Charles, it is said, became maddened by the sight of the rivers of blood which flowed before his eyes at the very gates of his palace, and then himself shot down his faithful and loyal subjects who fled to him, hoping they might find mercy at his feet. But God's retribution was to come. In less than 2 years after the massacre, Charles was stricken down by an illness which the most indifferent admitted to be a just judgment. He died in agonies of remorse, crying out perpetually, blood, blood, and blood poured from all the pores of his body until at last it gushed from his mouth, and so he died. Wow. Man, I don't even know what to say. Not all the consolations of the church for which he had committed one of the blackest crimes in history could save him from despair. There is deep in the heart of every man a conscience which tells him what is good and what is evil, and that conscience will speak. The unhappy king was but in the 25th year of his age when he came to his miserable end. Nor did his inhumane mother fare better. She died at Blois some years after her son, universally execrated and hated. In Rome, great rejoicings took place at the success of this diabolical massacre. The messenger who took the dispatch received a reward of 1,000 gold crowns. Cannon was fired from St. Angelo, bonfires lighted, and and Pius V being then dead, Pope Gregory the 13th went in great state to the Church of St. Mark to return thanks to God for a great blessing to the Roman Catholic Church. Over the portico of the church, a cloth was hung on which the papal share in the guilt of Charles IX was directly acknowledged in letters of gold, stating that the massacre had occurred after counsels had been given. Thrice the Pope went in state with all the cardinals and foreign ambassadors then in Rome to return thanks to God for the massacre. He caused medals to be struck in commemoration and the Vatican to be decorated with paintings representing the murder of Coligny and his friends. Now, with regard to this medal, a word must be said. Romanists, however much they may glory in the massacre, know well that it is something which tells against them in the minds of all honest men. Hence, they wish to clear the Pope of all complicity in the matter as far as possible. To this end, they have strenuously denied that the Pope ordered this medal to be struck, and as many copies of it as possible have been destroyed. But facts are the best argument. One copy remains at present in the British Museum. I have seen that medal and compared it with the facsimile which I possess. The initials of the name of the maker of the model are on it. He was a well-known artist of the time and age. If it be said that Pope did not order the casting of the medal, it should be remembered that the Pope was then both spiritual and temporal king of Rome and the Italian states. Is there anyone who will dare to say that such a medal could have been struck without his full permission? The doer of such a deed would have soon found himself in the Inquisition. But there is yet another, and if possibly stronger proof that the Church approved the crimes. We find in the lately published Life of Karl Manning the following statement, quote, "It is therefore undeniable that the pontiffs were morally within their right in the Crusades, the Armada, and the condemnation of boycotting in the plan of campaign," unquote. Life of Manning, Volume 2, page 625. Why then should they have not been within their rights in approving this wholesale massacre of Protestants? The revocation of the edicts of Nantes. On this subject, we do not purpose to enter here, except so far as to show that it was directly the act of the Jesuits. The letter and the appendix will prove this past dispute. The Jesuit in the confessional and the Jesuit as director has never failed in doing what he believes to be his duty. Who is there who will not give a meed of pity to the hapless princes who believed in them and submitted to their dictation like whipped hounds? The pity of it is that today these men are invited to England and encouraged there, and their pupils are given the first places of trust and importance in this country. Wow. Wow. That is crazy, guys. That is absolutely crazy. So, as I said, I got 1, 2, 3 more chapters to go. Then after that, the appendix, and then we're done with that book. After this book, what is impressed, honestly, in my spirit, in my heart, is to pick up, once again, the scriptural foundation and truth about divorce and remarriage, if your covenant spouse is still alive, is adultery. I've got to go back to it. Maybe that's why, or I don't know, maybe that's my calling. I don't know. But we're going to exhaust the subject, I believe. It's time, because there's many, many, many that are sitting in the pews. There are many that believe that they are living a godly life, though they are living in adultery. God wishes for none to perish. None. He loves us. He loves us. We've got to go to the Word of God. All right. Keep your eyes on Jesus, brothers and sisters. Your nose in the book, which is the Word of God, and embed the Word of God upon the tablets of your hearts, so you and I will not sin against God or be deceived. Bye-bye.